A wealthy CEO walks into his high-end clothing store, expecting business as usual, until he witnesses something that stops him in his tracks. A black woman asks for service, but the response she gets? Shocking. What happens next will turn the entire company upside down, and no one sees it coming. The Maison Alon boutique on Madison Avenue was a picture of sophistication. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in soft golden light, reflecting off polished marble floors. Rows of designer gowns, meticulously arranged by season and color, lined the walls like art pieces in a gallery. The soft hum of conversation and the occasional chime of a register created a refined but bustling atmosphere. Lisa Carter stepped inside, taking in the scene with practiced ease. She was no stranger to luxury retail. Dressed in an elegant navy pantsuit, her natural curls framing her face with effortless grace, she exuded the quiet confidence of someone who belonged in such a setting. Yet, as she walked further into the boutique, the energy around her subtly shifted. Jessica Moore, a sales associate with 5 years at Maison Alon, glanced up from the counter. Her gaze flickered over Lisa before she turned her attention elsewhere, pretending not to notice her. Instead, she adjusted the display of perfume bottles and straightened a stack of shopping bags. As if suddenly consumed with work, Lisa approached a display where a stunning emerald green evening gown caught her eye. The fabric shimmered under the lights, draping over the mannequin in a way that suggested effortless elegance. It was the kind of dress meant to turn heads at a gala. The kind that required no introduction. She reached out, fingertips brushing the smooth silk. Before turning to Jessica, "I'd love to try this on," she said, her tone even but expectant. Jessica barely looked up. "That dress is only available in limited sizes," she said flatly, before turning back to a rack of folded scarves. Lisa arched an eyebrow. "What sizes do you have?" Jessica sighed, then made a show of flipping through a small inventory tablet. "Unfortunately, I don't think we have anything in your size," she said, her voice tinged with forced politeness. Lisa didn't miss the way Jessica avoided eye contact. Nor did she miss the way another customer had just walked in, a blonde woman in her mid-30s, carrying a quilted Chanel handbag, and how Jessica's entire demeanor transformed. "Welcome to Maison Alon," Jessica said with a bright smile, moving toward the new arrival. "How can I assist you today?" Emily Watson returned the smile. "Actually, I was hoping to try on that green dress." "Of course," Jessica said warmly. "It's a gorgeous choice. Let me grab it in your size." Lisa watched the exchange, her hands tightening at her sides. A quiet heat rose in her chest, not just frustration, but something deeper, a familiarity. She had seen this play out before. She turned back toward Jessica, stepping forward so there was no way to be ignored. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I was just told that dress wasn't available." Jessica hesitated for a fraction of a second before forcing a smile. "Oh, well, let me double-check." She tapped at her tablet again, taking her time, as if reconsidering. Then, with a tilt of her head, she added, "But I should mention, that gown is from our exclusive collection. It's quite expensive." Lisa's jaw tensed. "And?" Jessica shrugged. "I just want to make sure it's the right fit for you." A few nearby shoppers had turned their heads now, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Lisa could feel their gazes, the quiet murmur of curiosity. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself before she spoke. "Let me make this simple," she said, holding Jessica's gaze. "Are you refusing to let me try on this dress?" Jessica hesitated. "No, of course not. I just..." "Then bring me the dress." The air between them thickened. Jessica's polite mask cracked for the briefest moment, revealing something unspoken but unmistakable. But before she could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "I'd like to see how this is handled," a man said calmly. David Carter, the CEO of Maison Alon, stood a few feet away. He had been observing in silence. Dressed in an understated gray suit, his posture relaxed but his expression unreadable. He hadn't planned on revealing himself today. This visit was meant to be discreet, an opportunity to gauge the customer experience firsthand. But now, watching one of his own employees systematically diminish a woman who had every right to be here, he felt a sharp pang of disappointment. Jessica paled. "Mr. Carter." "I." He lifted a hand. stopping her mid-sentence. His sharp blue eyes flickered between her and Lisa, before settling on the dress in question. "Bring her the gown," he said. Jessica hesitated, then reluctantly turned toward the stockroom. Lisa didn't look away from David. She studied him the way she had studied countless executives in boardrooms, measuring, assessing. The fact that he was here at all was interesting. But more than that, she wanted to know what he would do next. Because this wasn't just about a dress. And they both knew it. A hushed tension settled over the boutique. The soft murmur of casual conversation among shoppers faded as more and more eyes turned toward the unfolding scene near the fitting rooms. Some whispered among themselves. Their curiosity piqued. Others merely observed, waiting to see how things would play out. Lisa Carter stood unmoved, her arms crossed in a controlled stance. Though her expression remained neutral, there was an unmistakable fire behind her eyes. She had spent years navigating spaces where people underestimated her, where assumptions about status and wealth dictated treatment. But she never let it slide. Not then, and certainly not now. Jessica Moore, standing a few feet away, shifted on her heels. Her confident posture from moments ago wavered, but she quickly forced herself to regain composure. She exhaled sharply and gave Lisa a practiced, dismissive smile. "I just wanted to be sure you weren't wasting your time," Jessica said, her voice edged with a politeness so thin it nearly cracked. Lisa didn't immediately respond. She simply studied Jessica, letting the weight of the moment hang between them. But before she could speak, another voice cut through the tension. "She lied," Emily Watson said, stepping closer. The young woman looked from Lisa to Jessica. Her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and mild indignation. "She told me they had this dress in several sizes." Lisa let out a dry chuckle, her gaze never leaving Jessica. "Interesting," she mused. "When I asked, it was mysteriously unavailable. But the moment she thought someone else was a better fit, suddenly. There's plenty to choose from." Jessica opened her mouth as if to respond, but the words never came. The silence stretched uncomfortably. A few nearby customers exchanged glances, some nodding subtly in agreement, others merely watching in fascination. Then, another voice broke through, this one deeper, authoritative. "What exactly is going on here?" The voice belonged to David Carter. He had stepped forward, no longer content to simply observe. He removed his reading glasses, slipping them into the inside pocket of his jacket as he approached the small group. His gaze was calm, his demeanor collected, but there was a sharpness in his expression, one that made it clear he expected answers. Jessica stiffened. She glanced at him, and for a brief second, genuine fear flickered across her face. "Mr. Carter," she stammered, her voice almost a whisper. David didn't acknowledge her just yet. Instead, he turned to Lisa. "Ma'am, were you refused service here?" His tone was even, but there was an unmistakable weight behind the question. Lisa met his gaze without hesitation. "I was," she answered, keeping her voice steady. "I asked to try on that dress. I was told it wasn't available. Then, moments later, I watched this associate offer it to another customer without hesitation." David listened intently. "And this is not the first time you've experienced this in a luxury retail setting, is it?" Lisa's lips pressed together for a moment before she responded. "No, it isn't." A subtle shift occurred in the room. The weight of what was happening wasn't lost on those watching. David didn't react right away. He turned back toward Jessica, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he made a gesture toward the counter where the store's security monitors were displayed. A young employee behind the register hesitated before quickly responding to the silent command. She tapped a few buttons on the screen, and within seconds, footage from the past several minutes appeared. The boutique's security cameras had captured everything: the initial moment Lisa approached Jessica, the dismissive response, the clear shift in behavior the second Emily arrived. The undeniable contrast in treatment played out in crisp clarity on the monitor. Jessica's face lost all color. I wasn't," she started, but her words trailed off. She looked around, realizing that no explanation would undo what had just been exposed. David finally spoke, his tone cool. "Jessica, do you have any explanation for what we just watched?" Jessica swallowed hard, her hands fidgeting slightly. I didn't mean to." "To what?" Lisa interjected, her voice calm but firm. To get caught? Jessica's mouth opened, then shut. David let out a slow breath before speaking again. You do realize that the woman you just dismissed so effortlessly has been a VIP client at Maison Alon for years. Correct? Jessica's brows furrowed. David continued, his voice steady but edged with quiet authority. She has spent more money in our stores than most of the clients you serve on a daily basis. Yet, for some reason, you deemed her unworthy of even trying on a dress. Lisa tilted her head slightly. So what if I wasn't a VIP? She asked. Would you still have treated me this way? Jessica remained silent. The murmurs in the room grew louder. A few customers shook their heads in disapproval. Others stared at Jessica, waiting for some kind of justification. Some explanation that might make the scene before them less damning. But none came. David exhaled sharply, his patience worn thin. He turned to Jessica one last time. Maison Alon does not tolerate discrimination of any kind, he said, his voice unwavering. Effective immediately. You are no longer employed here. Jessica's eyes widened. Wait, that's final, David said, cutting her off. The boutique fell into silence. Jessica stood frozen for a moment, her expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. Then, slowly, she turned and walked toward the back room, her steps heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Lisa remained still, absorbing. She had seen countless stories like this. Had lived too many moments where people like Jessica acted with impunity. But this time was different. She turned her attention back to David. He met her gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. This wasn't over, not yet. A heavy silence settled over the boutique. The weight of what had just happened seemed to press against the walls. Hanging in the air like an unspoken challenge, employees stood frozen behind the counters, some exchanging wary glances. Customers lingered near the clothing racks, pretending to browse but stealing glances toward the front of the store, where the confrontation had just reached its peak. Jessica Moore, standing in stunned disbelief, was the only one who dared to break the silence. Her breath was uneven, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. You can't do this, she spat, her voice shaking. I was following the rules. Everyone knows not just anyone can shop here. David Carter's expression remained unreadable. He had heard enough excuses over the years to recognize when someone was grasping for control, clinging to a false sense of entitlement. He kept his voice level but firm. There are no rules that justify treating people differently based on your assumptions about them. He said, Maison Alon serves all customers with the same level of respect. You not only failed to uphold that standard, but you also damaged the integrity of this brand. Jessica let out a sharp, incredulous laugh, shaking her head. That's rich. You think you can fix everything with some PR stunt? You think I'm the only one who sees things this way? Lisa Carter watched the exchange with quiet intensity. She took a step forward, tilting her head slightly as she regarded Jessica. Did you ever stop to ask yourself why this felt normal to you? Lisa's voice was steady, piercing in its simplicity. Why it was so easy to dismiss me. What does that say about the way you see the world? Jessica's jaw tensed. She had no answer. Or, if she did, it was buried too deep for her to say aloud. At David's signal, security stepped forward. Jessica recoiled but knew there was no point in fighting it. She grabbed her purse from the counter, shoulders stiff as she walked toward the door. But just before stepping outside, she turned back, her voice dropping into something almost threatening. You'll regret this, she muttered. I'm not the only one who feels this way. With that, she was gone. The tension inside the boutique didn't dissipate immediately. The employees behind the registers exchanged nervous glances. A few customers murmured under their breath, while others simply turned back to their shopping, pretending nothing had happened. But the moment hadn't gone unnoticed. Near the entrance, a young woman, barely out of college, stood frozen with her phone raised in her hand. Her screen still glowed with the recording of everything that had just transpired. Within seconds, she tapped her screen, sending the video into the digital ether. And just like that, the world took notice. In less than an hour, the footage was everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Platform after platform flooded with reposts, captions, and endless commentary. Some praised David's swift action, lauding him for holding his employees accountable. Others remained skeptical, This is just damage control. One comment read, "Let's see if they actually make changes. This woman just wanted attention." Another user wrote, referring to Lisa, "People like her look for reasons to be offended." But among the chaos, voices of support grew louder. Customers shared their own experiences with discrimination in high-end retail spaces, turning the conversation into something bigger than just one incident. By the time David sat down for his emergency meeting, Maison Alon was trending nationwide. The conference room at the company's headquarters was filled with department heads, legal advisors, and public relations executives. A screen at the front displayed a live feed of social media activity, where notifications refreshed faster than they could be read. "This is escalating fast," one PR executive said, scrolling through a tablet. "The video has been viewed over 2 million times in the past 45 minutes. David leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "And what's the consensus?" The head of communications adjusted her glasses. "It's a mix. The majority is positive, but there's skepticism. Some are calling it performative, questioning whether this is a real commitment to change or just a PR move." A senior board member, seated near the end of the table, cleared his throat. "The bigger question is how this affects the business. If this turns into a political debate, we could lose a significant portion of our clientele." David's gaze hardened. "Then we should be asking ourselves what kind of clientele we want." The room fell silent for a beat. It wasn't just a question of public perception, it was a question of identity. What kind of company did they want Maison Alon to be? Lisa, who had been sitting quietly near the window, finally spoke. "You don't have to wonder if this will happen again," she said, looking around the room. "It will. The only thing you control is how you respond when it does." David nodded. He already knew what needed to happen next. The conference room at Maison Alon's headquarters was silent except for the soft hum of the city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. The tension in the air was thick, pressing against the polished wood table where the company's leadership team sat. Every face around the table was tight with unease. Some glanced at their phones, already bracing for the latest headlines. Others avoided eye contact altogether. David Carter sat at the head of the table, his fingers laced together, his expression unreadable. He had spent years in corporate boardrooms, navigating difficult conversations with shareholders and executives. But this wasn't a conversation about profit margins or seasonal trends. This was something deeper, something that threatened the very foundation of the company he had built. He let the silence linger for a moment before finally speaking. "Does anyone here believe this was just an isolated incident?" The question hung in the air. A few executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. No one spoke at first. Then, Michael Porter, a regional director with over a decade at Maison Alon, cleared his throat. "With all due respect, David, Jessica wasn't an anomaly," Michael said. His tone was measured, but there was a weight to his words. "She was just the one who got caught." A murmur rippled through the room. Michael leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "We've had complaints like this before. More than a few. Some of them were addressed. But let's be honest, most were ignored." David's jaw tightened. "Ignored by whom?" Michael exhaled sharply, glancing around before answering. "By everyone." The words sent an uneasy shift through the room. Some executives looked down at their notes. Others exchanged wary glances. David tapped his fingers against the table. "How many complaints are we talking about?" The room hesitated again. Then, after a brief pause, the head of customer relations, Sarah Mills, reached for her laptop and started typing. A few moments later, the screen at the front of the room lit up with a data report. The numbers spoke for themselves. More than half of all customer complaints in the past 2 years had involved issues of inconsistent service, with a disproportionate number coming from customers of color. Some were subtle, longer wait times, less attentive staff. Others were blatant, outright dismissals, condescending remarks, refusals to assist. Worse still, a handful of employees had received formal warnings for these behaviors in the past. But not a single one had been terminated before Jessica. A heavy silence settled over the room as the reality set in. Lisa, who had been sitting quietly near the end of the table, leaned forward. "So, what I experienced wasn't just about one employee," she said, her voice steady. "It's a pattern, and it's been happening for years." No one answered. Because there was nothing to deny. David sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He looked around at his team, studying their expressions. Some looked ashamed, others defensive. Sarah, the customer relations head, spoke up. We always intended to address these complaints. But what? David cut in, his voice sharp. Sarah hesitated, then sighed. But it wasn't seen as urgent. Lisa let out a dry laugh. Not urgent, she repeated. Tell me, if I hadn't been a VIP client, would I have been taken seriously yesterday? Another silence. Sarah opened her mouth as if to respond, then thought better of it. David's fingers drummed against the table again, a sign that his patience was running thin. He turned his attention to the head of our. What's our current process for handling these incidents? The man shifted uncomfortably. Formal complaints are reviewed, and if necessary, employees receive additional training or written warnings. David shook his head. And yet, here we are. Lisa crossed her arms. You're not dealing with a few bad apples, she said. You're dealing with a culture that's been allowed to grow unchecked. Michael Porter nodded. She's right. If we don't change the way this company operates from the inside out, this will happen again. And next time, it might be worse. David was already ahead of them. He had known the moment he saw that security footage that firing one employee wasn't going to fix this. He straightened in his chair. Here's what's going to happen, he said, his voice calm but firm. We're launching an internal investigation into our customer service practices. Every single complaint from the past 5 years will be reviewed. A few murmurs around the table. But David wasn't finished. We will be implementing mandatory training for all employees, associates, managers, executives. No exceptions. This isn't optional. Lisa nodded, but her gaze remained sharp. And what about accountability? David met her eyes. Any employee who refuses to comply with these new policies will be terminated. Period. That got everyone's attention. Sarah, the customer relations head, looked nervous. David, this is going to stir up resentment among some of the staff. Not everyone is going to accept these changes easily. Michael leaned forward. That's the part we need to consider carefully. What if there's pushback? What if employees start quitting? Or worse, what if there's a coordinated effort to undermine this from the inside? David considered that for a moment. He knew Michael had a point. Change always came with resistance. And this wouldn't be any different. But then he thought about what the alternative was. He thought about watching his company spiral into scandal after scandal, each one chipping away at its reputation until it was nothing but another cautionary tale. He straightened in his chair. If there are employees who can't handle the idea of treating every customer with respect, they're free to leave, he said, and if they choose to fight against this, we'll handle it. Lisa studied him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. Then let's get to work. The meeting adjourned soon after. But as the executives filed out of the room, David remained seated. He stared at the screen still displaying the report, at the years of ignored complaints, at the evidence of a problem that had been festering for far too long. Lisa was right. This wasn't just about what had happened in one store on one afternoon. This was bigger, and it was only just beginning. David Carter leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as he scrolled through the emails flooding his inbox. The subject lines alone told him everything he needed to know. Employees were furious. Some messages were veiled complaints about changing company culture. Others were more aggressive. A handful outright threatened to quit if Maison Alon continued down what they called a destructive path. One email stood out. It was short, blunt, and left no room for misinterpretation. If you keep pandering to the outrage mob, you're going to lose more than just customers. You'll lose us, too. No name, no sender information beyond a generic corporate address. But the meaning was clear. A knock at the door pulled David from his thoughts. Michael Porter stepped in, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something more cautious. He held a folder in one hand, his phone in the other. We have a problem, Michael said, closing the door behind him. David let out a dry chuckle. Just one? Michael didn't return the smile. Instead, he placed the folder on David's desk. 15%, he said. David frowned. 15% of what? Michael exhaled through his nose, looking weary. That's the percentage of employees, mostly long-term staff, who are openly resisting the changes. Some are just grumbling. But others? They're talking about walking out. A few have even started whispering that Jessica was a scapegoat, a victim of a hypersensitive society. David flipped open the folder. Inside were printed copies of messages from employee chat logs, internal emails, and even snippets from group texts. Some employees were angry, others felt betrayed. A few were openly trying to organize resistance. They think this was about politics, David muttered, shaking his head. Michael sat down across from him. They think this was about punishing one of their own. Jessica was well liked, at least among that group. They don't see the bigger picture. They see someone they worked with for years getting fired over something they probably thought was harmless. David's expression darkened. And do you think it was harmless? Michael didn't hesitate. No, but that doesn't mean they'll see it that way. David drummed his fingers against the desk, his mind working through the implications. He had anticipated pushback from customers, from the media, but he had underestimated how deep the rot went inside his own company. The sound of his phone vibrating on the desk pulled him back. He glanced at the screen. A text from Lisa. Check your email, now. David swiped over to his inbox, where a new message sat at the top. The subject line read, "Internal leak, read immediately." He clicked it open. The email contained an attachment, along with a short note from Lisa. "This was forwarded to me anonymously. You need to see it before this blows up." David opened the attachment. It was an internal memo from a mid-level manager, someone just high enough to have influence but not high enough to be on David's radar. The contents made his stomach turn. The email was dated months before the incident with Jessica. It detailed a series of customer complaints, specifically citing Jessica and a few other employees for discriminatory behavior. It wasn't vague. Customers had reported being ignored, dismissed, or subtly guided toward cheaper products while white customers received full service treatment. And yet, the memo didn't recommend corrective action. Instead, it advised against taking any drastic measures that might cause unnecessary tension among staff. David scrolled further down. There was a response from another manager, agreeing that disciplining these employees too harshly could negatively impact morale. He exhaled sharply, pushing his chair back. Michael raised an eyebrow. That bad? David turned the screen toward him. Michael skimmed the email, his face darkening with every line. When he finished, he sat back and let out a low whistle. So it wasn't just Jessica. Michael muttered. They knew and did nothing. David stood, pacing toward the window. The city stretched out before him, its skyline sharp against the setting sun. This is bigger than a PR nightmare, he said quietly. This is institutional. Michael nodded slowly. And if this leaks, it will. David interrupted. Lisa wouldn't have gotten this if someone inside wasn't already looking to expose it. A heavy silence settled between them. Then, Michael spoke again. If we go public with this, it's going to get worse before it gets better. David turned back to face him. So what do we do? Michael hesitated, then leaned forward. We control the narrative before someone else does. We get ahead of it. Full transparency. David nodded, his decision made. Then we start now. David Carter stood at the window of his office, staring out at the New York skyline. The city stretched before him, busy and indifferent, moving forward no matter what battles raged inside the walls of Maison Alon. He had made difficult decisions before, ones that determined the company's future, affected profit margins, shifted brand direction. But this was different. This wasn't about numbers. It was about dismantling something rotten at the core. He turned away from the window and picked up his phone. Effective immediately, he told his assistant. Any manager found to have suppressed discrimination complaints is suspended pending review. Notify them now. The response came quickly. Shocked silence on the other end of the call. Then a hesitant, "Understood, sir." It was only the first step. An hour later, a company-wide memo went out, announcing the formation of an independent review board to audit customer complaints from the past 5 years. Every ignored concern, every dismissed allegation, every incident swept under the rug would be scrutinized. No more looking away. Another policy followed, this one public. Maison Alon officially declared a zero-tolerance stance on discrimination, complete with a structured process for reporting and consequences that could no longer be sidestepped. The press release was carefully worded. designed to reassure both customers and employees. But David knew not everyone would see it that way. The backlash was immediate. Lisa had barely sat down at her desk when the first messages started rolling in. Some were supportive, thanking her for speaking out, for forcing a conversation that should have happened long ago. Others were less kind. "You're ruining this company. Maybe you should shop somewhere else if you don't like how things are run." And one that made her pause. "People like you always want to play the victim. Enjoy the attention while it lasts." She closed her laptop, exhaling slowly. This was expected, predictable, even, but it didn't make it any less exhausting. Later that afternoon, she arrived at Maison Alon's headquarters for a scheduled employee town hall, a meeting that David had insisted on. "If we're going to fix this, people need to say what they're thinking out loud," he had told her, "even if it's ugly." And ugly it was. The conference room was packed with employees, sales associates, department heads, back office staff. The tension was immediate, simmering beneath the surface. Lisa took a seat near the front as David stepped to the podium. "I know there's frustration in this room," he began. "I know some of you feel like this decision is an attack on the company. Or on you personally. But let me be very clear, this is about making Maison Alon better. Stronger. And we can't do that if we ignore the truth." Someone scoffed. A man near the back, arms crossed tightly over his chest. "The truth?" he said. "The truth is, you fired someone over one mistake." Lisa turned toward him. "One mistake," she repeated. "That's how you see it?" The man, older, maybe in his 50s, with the air of someone who had been in the business long enough to feel untouchable, nodded. "Jessica worked here for years. One bad interaction and suddenly she's gone? That's not justice. That's overkill." A murmur of agreement rippled through part of the crowd. Lisa kept her expression neutral. "Tell me something," she said. "When Jessica dismissed me, when she assumed I wasn't worth her time, how many times do you think she'd done that before?" The man hesitated, shifting in his seat. Lisa pressed on. "How many other customers walked away from this store, feeling like they didn't belong? How many complaints were ignored because people like Jessica weren't held accountable?" Silence. Lisa let the quiet settle before she spoke again. "If you're more upset about Jessica losing her job than about the people she made feel invisible, maybe the real problem isn't her firing." David stepped forward. "No one in this room is being punished for mistakes," he said. "But if you believe respect is optional, that you can treat people differently based on your assumptions about them, then Maison Alon is no longer the place for you." And then it happened. A woman near the front, a senior sales associate, stood abruptly. "Then maybe it isn't," she said, her voice tight. She grabbed her bag, eyes flashing with defiance, and walked out. Another followed, and another. By the end of the meeting, 7 employees had resigned on the spot. By the next morning, that number had doubled. David sat in his office, looking over the resignation letters. Michael Porter walked in, his expression unreadable. "That's 20 employees gone," Michael said. "More could follow." David nodded. "Let them." Michael studied him for a moment, then let out a slow breath. "You know this is going to hurt us, right? At least in the short term." David leaned back in his chair. "Change always does." The headlines came fast, and they were ruthless. By the next morning, Maison Alon was no longer just a fashion brand. It was a battleground for public debate. Luxury Business Daily questioned the company's future with a pointed headline: "Maison Alon sacrifices tradition for social activism. Will it survive?" Another major outlet framed the controversy more aggressively: "Fashion giant buckles under social pressure. Risks alienating loyal clientele." And then there were the more inflammatory takes. Designed to stir outrage: "Employees fired for political incorrectness. Has cancel culture gone too far?" David Carter skimmed the articles in his office, his jaw tightening with every line. He had expected pushback, but the speed and intensity of it were staggering. It wasn't just customers debating the issue now. Investors were watching. Competitors were taking advantage of the chaos. Then came the email from the board: "Emergency shareholder meetings scheduled for 3 p.m. Attendance mandatory." By the time David walked into the conference room, the atmosphere was already thick with tension. The long mahogany table was filled with some of the most powerful figures in Maison Alon's financial structure, men and women who rarely intervened in day-to-day affairs but had the power to dictate the company's future with a single vote. Richard Vaughan, one of the most influential shareholders, sat near the center, fingers steepled together. His presence alone was enough to set the tone. He wasn't just here to listen. He was here to challenge. David took his seat, exuding calm despite the heat of the moment. A longtime investor, Harold Stein, was the first to speak. David, we're all aware of the controversy unfolding. The question is, do you understand the damage that's being done to the Maison Alon brand? David met his gaze evenly. I understand the challenges of change, but I also understand the cost of ignoring it. Another shareholder leaned forward, adjusting his cufflinks. Let's not dance around the issue. In the past week, we've seen staff resignations, negative press, and, let's be frank, a drop in sales. Luxury clients don't like instability. We're losing a core demographic. David didn't flinch. He had come prepared. He turned to the head of analytics, who activated a large screen displaying market data. Sales did take an initial hit, David acknowledged, but take a look at the long-term projections. The screen shifted, showing a breakdown of consumer response. Though some high-net-worth clients had withdrawn purchases, another trend was emerging, an influx of new customers. Younger demographics, socially conscious consumers, and notably, an increase in purchases from Black and minority customers who had previously felt alienated by the brand. We're gaining more than we're losing. David continued, Maison Alon isn't just a name, it's an institution. And institutions only survive when they evolve. Murmurs broke out across the room. Some shareholders nodded, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Richard Vaughan finally spoke. That's a compelling argument, David, but let's not pretend this is just about numbers. David turned to him, waiting. This company was built on exclusivity. Vaughan said smoothly, people don't buy Maison Alon because they need clothes. They buy because it represents status, refinement, a certain way of life. If you dilute that, you risk turning this into just another fashion house. And that is something I won't stand by and watch. David leaned forward slightly. Are you suggesting that inclusivity and exclusivity can't coexist? Vaughan gave a practiced smile. I'm saying that if you alienate the core base that built this brand, you won't have a company left to run. A few nods of agreement rippled through the room. David inhaled slowly. He had spent years navigating corporate politics. But this was different. This wasn't just about protecting a brand. This was about standing firm in the face of pressure from those who saw fairness as a threat. He met Vaughan's gaze head-on. What I'm hearing, David said, his tone controlled, is that you'd rather cling to outdated perceptions of status than embrace the fact that the world is changing. Vaughan's expression didn't falter, but a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. David continued, Maison Alon doesn't need to be a relic of the past. It can be a leader in the future of luxury. And if that means redefining what exclusivity looks like, then that's what we'll do. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Then Vaughan sat back, his smile returning, but colder this time. Then you'd better be prepared for what comes next, he said. David didn't respond. He didn't need to. He already knew Vaughan was planning something. Meanwhile, outside the boardroom, Lisa sat at a coffee shop across the street, reading an anonymous message that had just appeared in her inbox. Be careful, they're coming after you next. David Carter stepped out of the boardroom and into the quiet hallway. Exhaling slowly, the meeting had ended, but the battle was far from over. The tension in the room, the calculated words of Richard Vaughan, it was clear that the fight for Maison Alon's future had only just begun. If he didn't take control of the situation soon, he might not be in a position to fight at all. He loosened his tie slightly as he made his way toward his office, his mind racing through the possible moves he could make next. He needed leverage. He needed something strong enough to counter the pressure coming from the board, the media, and the employees still resistant to change. His phone buzzed in his pocket. When he pulled it out, Lisa Carter's name flashed on the screen. Lisa, he answered, his voice steady despite the weight on his shoulders. I heard about the board meeting, she said without preamble. They're coming after you, aren't they? David leaned against his desk, rubbing his temple. Vaughan is making his move. He's rallying the old guard, painting me as reckless, claiming we're alienating our core customers. Lisa didn't hesitate. Then we need to change the narrative before he does. David frowned slightly. And how exactly do you propose we do that? I have connections, she said. Influential people who believe in what you're doing. If we want to turn this around, we don't just defend your decisions, we take control of the conversation. Make it about something bigger than just Maison Alon. Make it about the industry as a whole. David listened carefully. She wasn't wrong. The backlash wasn't just about one company. It was about a shift in the entire luxury retail world. Some people feared that shift, while others embraced it. He needed to make sure the right voices were the loudest. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed again. Another call. He glanced at the name and felt a flicker of surprise. Emily Watson. He put Lisa on hold and answered. Emily? David, she said, her tone urgent. I saw what's happening, and I want to help. David straightened slightly. Emily Watson wasn't just another customer. She came from a powerful family with deep ties to the fashion industry. Her father was a major investor in several global brands, and her mother sat on the board of one of the largest luxury fashion houses in Europe. I appreciate the support, David said carefully, but this is getting messy. You sure you want to be involved? Emily didn't hesitate. I was there when it happened. David, I saw how that sales associate treated Lisa. I saw how your company handled it. And I saw how some people are trying to twist the story now. David ran a hand over his jaw. What are you proposing? I'm going to the press. She said simply. I'll publicly support the changes you're making. And I'll make it clear that the people pushing back are the ones afraid of progress. David considered it. Coming from her, this wasn't just another statement from an activist or a corporate spokesperson. This was a woman who embodied the very elite class that critics claimed Maison Alon was alienating. If she spoke up, people would listen. But before he could say anything, she continued. And that's not all, she said. I have friends in the industry, high-profile designers, investors, editors. I'll get them talking. You don't just need damage control. You need momentum. David let out a slow breath, nodding to himself. This was exactly the kind of reinforcement he needed. All right, he said finally. Let's do it. Later that night, the media narrative began to shift. Emily Watson's statement spread quickly across major publications. Her interview with a top fashion magazine made waves, especially one particular quote that people latched onto. Luxury isn't about exclusion, it's about excellence. And Maison Alon is proving that excellence has no color, no barriers, just a standard of quality that should be accessible to anyone who appreciates it. Social media exploded with renewed support for Maison Alon. Celebrities, influencers, and industry insiders chimed in, reinforcing the idea that true luxury wasn't about gatekeeping, it was about craftsmanship, innovation, and evolution. And then, just as the momentum swung in David's favor, something else happened. An anonymous email leaked to several reporters. The subject line was simple. Richard Vaughn. The truth you haven't heard. Inside was a series of confidential memos, documents revealing that Vaughn had actively protected store managers accused of discrimination. Even worse, there were indications that he had used company resources to shield those employees from complaints, ensuring that incidents were buried before they could reach corporate leadership. David stared at the leaked documents on his screen, his pulse steady but his mind racing. This wasn't just a scandal. This was a weapon. The leaked email hit the internet like a wildfire. Within hours, social media erupted with outrage, dragging Richard Vaughn into the center of the storm. Hashtags calling for his resignation trended across platforms. Customers shared their own experiences with discrimination at Maison Alon, adding fuel to the growing movement against him. Major news outlets picked up the story, and soon, investigative journalists began digging into Vaughn's past. What they found wasn't just troubling, it was damning. Records surfaced linking him to previous scandals at other companies, where complaints of workplace discrimination had mysteriously disappeared under his watch. Former employees came forward, detailing how Vaughn had protected managers accused of misconduct. It became clear that this wasn't an isolated case, this was a pattern. Vaughn wasted no time striking back. The next morning, he appeared on a national business news segment, calm and composed, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of a man who had weathered storms before. This is nothing more than a smear campaign, he told the host. I have dedicated years to building successful companies. And now I'm being attacked for doing my job. No company can survive if it prioritizes emotions over profit. Maison Alon is heading down a dangerous path, one that will alienate its loyal customers and lead to financial ruin. The segment played on a loop throughout the day. His words sparked a fresh wave of debate. Supporters of Vaughn argued that corporate decisions should be made with the bottom line in mind, not social ideals. Others fired back, accusing him of clinging to outdated, exclusionary business practices. David Carter watched the interview from his office, arms crossed, jaw tight. Lisa sat across from him, her phone lighting up with notifications as reporters reached out for comments. He's doubling down, she said, trying to paint you as reckless. David exhaled sharply. Then we need to take control of the narrative before he does. An hour later, a press conference was set. Every major media outlet was invited. The room buzzed with anticipation, cameras flashing as David took the podium. He didn't waste time. Maison Alon is not in crisis, he stated firmly. We are at a turning point. Silence fell over the room as he continued. We don't collapse because we choose fairness. We collapse if we allow a toxic system to continue unchecked. And we will not let that happen. He laid out the company's restructuring plan in clear, decisive terms. A full-scale audit of past customer service complaints. Mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all employees, from entry-level staff to executives. A new, transparent grievance system to ensure that every customer and employee has a voice. This is not about politics. This is about integrity, he said, his voice steady. Maison Alon will not be a company that ignores the concerns of its customers. We will be a company that sets the standard for excellence in both service and ethics. A few reporters started firing questions at him. But before David could respond, Lisa stood up. I have something to say, she announced, stepping forward. The cameras turned toward her as she addressed the room. This isn't just about one store. It's not just about Maison Alon. It's about an industry that has, for too long, made certain people feel like they don't belong. She looked directly at the reporters. If you think this is just one incident, ask yourself, why are so many people speaking out now? Why are so many sharing similar experiences? The weight of her words settled over the room. Then, just as the press conference was reaching its peak, David's phone vibrated in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. A text from his assistant. You need to see what's happening outside. The tension in the room shifted as murmurs spread. Someone checked their phone. Then another. A reporter near the back whispered something to her cameraman. David motioned to his team. And within moments, a live feed was pulled up on a monitor behind him. Outside the Maison Alon headquarters, a small but vocal group of employees had gathered in protest. Signs waved in the air, carrying messages that echoed Vaughn's rhetoric. Tradition over trends. Luxury should stay exclusive. Stop letting social justice ruin business. Reporters immediately turned their attention to the scene unfolding outside. The contrast was stark, the movement inside calling for progress, the demonstration outside clinging to the past. Lisa watched the screen, then turned to David. They're making their stand, she murmured. David nodded, eyes narrowing. So will we. The protest outside Maison Alon's headquarters was growing. Cameras flashed, reporters angled for better shots, and the voices of employees chanting their discontent filled the street. Signs demanding a return to tradition waved above the crowd. Inside the boardroom, Richard Vaughn was watching the spectacle unfold with a satisfied smirk. David Carter sat across from him, unfazed. He had spent the last 24 hours preparing for what he knew was coming. Vaughn wasn't just trying to win the media war, he was going for the kill. A senior board member cleared his throat. Gentlemen, let's get to the matter at hand. We have gathered here today to address the growing instability surrounding Maison Alon. Mr. Vaughn has formally requested a vote of no confidence against CEO David Carter. Vaughn leaned forward, voice dripping with feigned concern. This isn't personal, David. It's about leadership. You've let emotions dictate policy. We are hemorrhaging high-value clients. We have employees walking out. Investors are nervous. This company wasn't built on activism, it was built on luxury. David remained silent, letting Vaughn dig his own grave. This chaos cannot continue. Vaughn went on. I propose that we move forward with a leadership change before Maison Alon collapses under this reckless agenda." A murmur spread through the room. Some board members nodded. Others remained skeptical. Vaughn had spent decades cultivating influence here. This was his moment, or so he thought. David leaned back in his chair, finally speaking. "Before the board votes, I'd like to present some additional information." With a nod, his assistant dimmed the lights. The screen at the front of the room flickered to life, displaying a series of internal emails. The subject lines alone made Vaughn's smirk disappear. Client segmentation strategy, maintaining brand prestige, filtered hiring practices for sales teams, and the worst one of all, keeping the right image, limiting customer demographics. David stood, walking toward the screen. "These are internal communications between Richard Vaughn and several senior managers," he said, emails where he explicitly discusses ensuring that certain clientele are not encouraged to shop with us. Emails where he pressures recruiters to subtly steer hiring away from candidates that don't fit the Maison Alon aesthetic. The silence in the boardroom was suffocating. David turned to face Vaughn. "You claim I've let emotions cloud my judgment, but what I see here is a calculated, systematic effort to exclude customers and employees based on nothing but prejudice." Vaughn's face darkened. "This is taken out of context." David ignored him. "This is not just unethical, it's a liability. If these emails go public, we aren't just looking at bad press. We're looking at lawsuits, government investigations, financial losses that make this so-called crisis look insignificant." A few board members shifted uncomfortably. The tide was turning. Then, the doors at the back of the boardroom swung open. Lisa Carter stepped inside, followed by 3 individuals, former employees, people who had been silenced, fired, or pushed out for speaking up about the discrimination Vaughn had protected. Lisa's voice was calm but firm. These people were let go after filing complaints about unfair hiring practices and customer discrimination. None of them were given proper hearings. Their concerns were buried, and now, they're here to make sure that doesn't happen again. One of the former employees, a former store manager named Aaron Phillips, stepped forward. "I was terminated 3 weeks after reporting that a district supervisor was instructing sales associates to subtly steer certain customers away from high-end purchases." He paused. "That supervisor still works here." The murmurs grew louder. Then, the final blow. A new voice cut through the room. It came from the speakers in the corner of the room, playing a recording that David's team had obtained just hours ago. Vaughn's voice. "This isn't about ethics. It's about keeping the brand in the right hands. We don't need to cater to people who were never meant to be our customers in the first place." Gasps rippled across the boardroom. One of the senior investors, who had been hesitant about David's leadership, turned to Vaughn with a look of disgust. Vaughn paled. "Where did you get that?" David didn't answer. He didn't need to. The board chair cleared his throat. "I think we've heard enough." The vote wasn't even close. One by one, Vaughn's former allies turned against him. Those who had supported his motion for David's removal now withdrew their backing. A few members openly called for his resignation. By the time the meeting ended, Richard Vaughn was no longer a part of Maison Alon. As he left the boardroom, his influence shattered. David watched him go with quiet satisfaction. Lisa stepped up beside him. "That was satisfying." David exhaled, nodding. "But this isn't over. Now, we rebuild." The removal of Richard Vaughn was a victory. But as David Carter stepped into his office the next morning, he knew the hardest part was still ahead. The damage had already been done. Customers were wary, employees were divided, and investors were still cautious. Changing leadership was one thing. Changing an entire culture was another. Maison Alon's reputation was on the line. If David wanted to save it, he had to prove that this wasn't just a corporate PR move. It had to be real. His first order of business was action. Within 24 hours, a company-wide memo was sent, outlining the first steps of a massive restructuring plan. All employees, regardless of position, were required to undergo mandatory training on inclusive customer service and workplace ethics. No exceptions. A new internal oversight committee was established, composed of employees from different levels of the company, as well as longtime customers. Their role was simple: ensure transparency and hold leadership accountable. Hiring policies were revised, The old system, where managers could quietly filter applicants based on unwritten biases, was dismantled. From now on, diversity wasn't just encouraged, it was required. And finally, the most public-facing change, Maison Alon launched a new initiative aimed at reshaping the luxury industry's standards for inclusivity. No more quiet promises. This time, they were setting the bar. Lisa Carter had been skeptical when David first asked her to be a part of the initiative. "You want me to work with you?" she had asked. "After everything?" David had nodded without hesitation. "You held us accountable when no one else did. That's exactly the kind of voice we need in the room." Now, as she sat across from him in his office, she was beginning to see that he was serious. "This isn't going to be easy," she said, watching him carefully. "You're going to lose people." David sighed, rubbing his temple. "We already are." She wasn't surprised. The backlash had been swift. A faction of longtime employees was resisting the changes, muttering that the company was moving too fast, that tradition was being sacrificed. Some customers, those who had embraced Vaughn's vision of exclusivity, had taken to social media, calling for a boycott. Sales had dipped, not drastically, but enough for the board to notice. David had expected this. He had seen it before in other industries. But knowing it was coming didn't make it any easier to stomach. Lisa leaned back, arms crossed. "Do you regret it?" David met her gaze. "No." Her lips curved slightly. "Then don't stop now." The fallout from Richard Vaughn's downfall wasn't over. His removal from Maison Alon had been swift. But now, legal scrutiny followed. What had started as a corporate scandal quickly unraveled into something far worse. Regulatory agencies opened official investigations, digging into his financial history. It didn't take long before the press got hold of leaked tax records, exposing years of suspicious transactions. Vaughn had funneled company funds into shadow accounts, disguised as consulting fees and strategic partnerships. The money trail led to a tangled web of offshore accounts and shell corporations. But financial fraud wasn't the only discovery. Internal memos surfaced, detailing Vaughn's manipulation of hiring and promotion processes within Maison Alon. He had personally intervened to ensure that key leadership positions were held by individuals who aligned with his ideology, people who saw exclusivity not just as a business strategy, but as a way to keep certain customers and employees out. The headlines were ruthless. Former Maison Alon executive faces investigation for financial crimes. Leaked documents revealed discriminatory hiring practices under Vaughn's leadership. Luxury industry in shock. The fall of Richard Vaughn. Then came the lawsuits. A group of shareholders filed a civil suit, demanding damages for the financial losses caused by Vaughn's mismanagement. Former employees who had been wrongfully terminated came forward with legal claims of workplace discrimination. The cases piled up, painting a picture of a man who had built his empire on deception and control. The trial began 6 months after his removal. By then, Vaughn was no longer the powerful businessman who had once dictated the fate of Maison Alon. He was a defendant in a courtroom, facing questions he could no longer deflect. Lisa Carter and David Carter followed the proceedings closely. Neither of them had pressed charges personally, but they knew this case wasn't just about Vaughn, it was about the larger issue his leadership had embodied. Inside the courtroom, Vaughn sat stiffly in his tailored suit, his arrogance now a thin veil over the reality that he was losing everything. The prosecution laid out the evidence piece by piece. Financial fraud, manipulation of corporate policies, deliberate suppression of employee complaints. Every document, every witness, every testimony chipped away at the illusion of control he had once wielded. When the verdict came, it was decisive. Guilty on multiple counts of financial fraud. Guilty of corporate misconduct. A settlement reached in the shareholder lawsuit. Vaughn was stripped of any remaining influence in the business world. His assets were seized, his reputation destroyed. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, but there were no grand statements from him. No triumphant spin to salvage his name. He left through the back entrance. A man who had once dictated the future of Maison Alon now reduced to a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, the company he had tried to control was moving forward. Maison Alon wasn't just surviving, it was rebuilding. Slowly, the customers who had walked away began to return. The transparency of the restructuring process reassured them that the changes were real. A new wave of employees entered the company, young, ambitious, and determined to be part of something different. Diversity wasn't just a marketing slogan anymore, it was embedded in the hiring process. In leadership training, in the company's new mission, revenue, which had dipped in the wake of the scandal, started to climb again, not overnight, but steadily. Customers saw the difference. The world saw the difference. One afternoon, Lisa walked past a Maison Alon storefront. The display window had been redone, sleek and elegant as always, but with a new message: luxury for all, excellence without exclusion. Through the glass, she saw a sales associate greet a black customer with the same warmth and attentiveness as anyone else. No hesitation, no subtle condescension, just service, as it should be. She smiled. Change had come. David Carter had barely caught his breath from the fallout of Richard Vaughn's downfall when a new challenge emerged. At first, it was subtle, whispers in the industry, a shift in marketing strategies, a few familiar names appearing in unexpected places. But soon, it became clear. Maison Alon's victory wasn't as absolute as he had hoped. A rival was moving in. Sterling Luxe, a luxury fashion conglomerate with deep pockets and an even deeper influence in the industry, had launched a campaign that, while never mentioning Maison Alon by name, was clearly designed as a counterattack. Sleek billboards appeared in major cities with the tagline, "Fashion, not politics." High-profile influencers, some of whom had once been Maison Alon loyalists, suddenly began endorsing Sterling Luxe. The message was unmistakable. Sterling Luxe was positioning itself as the brand for those who resented the changes happening at Maison Alon. David studied one of the new Sterling Luxe ads on his office screen. The imagery was sophisticated but carried a quiet defiance. It was a direct response to Maison Alon's recent transformation, playing into the fears of those who believed that luxury should remain exclusive in more ways than one. His assistant entered, a look of concern on her face. "You're going to want to see this." She handed him a report. Inside was a list of former Maison Alon employees, managers, designers, marketing strategists, who had been let go or resigned in the wake of Vaughn's scandal. Nearly all of them had found a new home at Sterling Luxe. Lisa Carter was already waiting in his office when he finished reading. "They're building a stronghold," she said. "This isn't just about competition. This is about revenge." David set the report down. "They're capitalizing on our vulnerability. And they're doing it smart." Lisa nodded. "They're tapping into people's exhaustion with change. There's a market for that. People who don't want to think about ethics when they buy a handbag. People who see what we're doing as an attack on what they grew up believing luxury should be." The media had picked up on the growing divide. Articles began surfacing with provocative headlines. "Has Maison Alon gone too far? Customers are tired of politics in fashion. Is Sterling Luxe the answer? Can a luxury brand survive when it challenges its own customers?" The shift was impossible to ignore. While Maison Alon was still gaining support from progressive-minded consumers, Sterling Luxe was absorbing those who felt alienated by the industry's new direction. The market was splitting in two. And then came the real blow. A bombshell investigative piece was published in a major business magazine, exposing financial links between Sterling Luxe and Richard Vaughn. Documents showed that Vaughn had received legal assistance from entities connected to the company. Some of his legal fees had even been covered through a web of corporate accounts tied back to Sterling Luxe executives. Lisa set her phone down after reading the article. They weren't just waiting for us to fall. They were helping Vaughn stay afloat. David exhaled slowly, pressing his fingertips together. He had hoped this fight had ended with Vaughn's departure. Now, he saw the truth. This wasn't over. It had only changed shape. Maison Alon was no longer fighting a battle within. Now, they had an enemy on the outside. David Carter sat at the head of the long, polished conference table, his hands clasped as he listened to the heated debate unfolding around him. The senior leadership team of Maison Alon was divided. "We need to stay out of this," one executive insisted. "Engaging with Sterling Luxe will only escalate the situation. Let them play their games. We stay focused on our vision. Staying silent is not an option." Lisa Carter countered. She leaned forward, voice sharp with conviction. "They aren't just competing with us. They're trying to dismantle everything we've built. And we're going to let them?" A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Others shifted uncomfortably. David exhaled slowly, his mind running through the options. He understood the risk of retaliation. Sterling Lux had resources, influence, and a growing faction of customers who wanted Maison Alon to fail. But Lisa was right. This was bigger than a brand rivalry. The decision was interrupted by a buzz on Lisa's phone. She glanced at the screen, her expression hardening. "I need a moment," she said, rising from her chair. David watched her step outside before returning his focus to the discussion. "If we counter too aggressively, we risk looking desperate," another executive warned. "The public might see it as us trying to drag them down rather than standing on our own merits. But if we do nothing, we let them control the narrative." Michael Porter, head of strategy, added, "Right now, they're painting us as out of touch with luxury consumers. We have to remind people why they chose us in the first place." Before David could respond, Lisa re-entered the room, her face unreadable. She walked straight to David and leaned down, speaking low enough that only he could hear. "I just got a message," she murmured, "from someone inside the company." David stiffened. "What kind of message?" Lisa glanced at the rest of the team, then stepped back. "We need to talk, alone." David nodded once, then addressed the room. "Meeting adjourned. We'll reconvene in the morning." As the executives filed out, David and Lisa moved to his private office. The moment the door closed, Lisa handed him her phone. An anonymous message flashed across the screen. "Sterling Lux is buying shares. Quietly, they're positioning for a takeover." David's grip tightened on the phone. "How reliable is this?" Lisa folded her arms. "It's someone inside our own walls. Someone who doesn't want to see this happen." David felt a slow, simmering anger rise in his chest. A hostile takeover wasn't just a business move, it was a direct attack. If Sterling Lux gained enough control, everything Maison Alon had fought for would be erased. His mind raced through the possibilities. Someone at the top had to be facilitating this. A board member? An executive? Someone with access to financial decisions. "They're trying to take us down from the inside," Lisa said, "and we don't know who's helping them." David exhaled sharply. "Then we find out, before it's too late." David Carter sat at the head of the boardroom table, his face impassive as he scanned the expressions of the assembled shareholders. Some were loyal to him, some were undecided, and some, he suspected, were already looking toward Sterling Lux as their future. He placed his hands flat on the table and spoke calmly, but with weight behind every word. "We are facing a hostile takeover. This is not speculation. This is fact." A murmur rippled through the room. "Sterling Lux currently holds 18% of our shares. And as we speak, they are negotiating with a group of our own shareholders, people in this room, to gain control of an additional 12%. If they succeed, they will control Maison Alon." A sharp intake of breath from one of the investors confirmed his worst fears. David pressed on. "Let me be clear. If they win, they will reverse everything we've built over the last year. They will return us to the old Maison Alon, the one that thrived on exclusivity at the cost of integrity. If you think for 1 second that they care about preserving this brand, you are mistaken. They want us to fail so they can consume us." A few investors exchanged uncertain glances. Lisa Carter, standing near the window, arms crossed, watched the reactions carefully. She had spent the last 24 hours following a lead, one that confirmed what they had feared. She spoke up. "Sterling Lux isn't just buying up shares. They have someone on the inside." That got their attention. The tension in the room tightened. Lisa placed a folder in front of David, then turned to face the group. "One of our own executives has been in direct contact with Sterling Lux. They've been feeding them inside information, ensuring that this takeover happens." David picked up the folder, opened it, and slid a printed email across the table. "This is a message sent 2 weeks ago from one of our senior executives to Sterling Lux's board." Lisa read it aloud. "Once we secure the votes, David Carter will be forced out. I want assurances that my position will be elevated in the new leadership structure." Murmurs turned into hushed exclamations. A few heads turned toward a tall man near the far end of the table, Mark Ellison, Senior Vice President of Global Strategy. Mark's face remained composed, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He had been caught. David leaned forward. "Mark, do you want to deny this?" Mark hesitated. Then, he sighed, shaking his head. I did what was necessary. You think you can fight against the market? Against consumer demand? Maison Alon is bleeding money. The world doesn't want your revolution. David, you mean Sterling Lux doesn't want it? Lisa corrected. Mark shrugged. What's the difference? They're giving the people what they want. David's voice was quiet but firm. No, they're giving people an excuse to go backward. Mark exhaled sharply, then leaned back in his chair. Well, it doesn't matter, does it? The vote is happening in 48 hours. And we have the numbers. Lisa smiled slightly. Not yet. Mark's smirk faded. David stood. We still have a chance. If we can convince enough of you in this room that Maison Alon is worth protecting, then we fight. If we lose, then Mark is right. This company will belong to Sterling Lux. He looked at each shareholder in turn. But if we win, we prove that luxury and integrity can exist together. That progress isn't a weakness. That Maison Alon stands for something more than profit. Silence stretched in the boardroom. Lisa could see it. Some of them were still on the fence. They had 48 hours to tip the balance. The tension in the air was palpable as David Carter and Lisa Carter prepared for the most critical battle of their careers. The boardroom vote that would determine the fate of Maison Alon was just hours away. And the odds were stacked against them. Sterling Lux believed they had already won. But David and Lisa had one last move to play. Lisa took the lead in executing the first phase of their strategy. That morning, she sent a detailed report to the most influential financial and business news outlets, exposing Sterling Lux's underhanded tactics. The documents contained undeniable proof. Bank transactions linking Sterling Lux to Richard Vaughan. Private emails discussing strategies to undermine Maison Alon. And even evidence that Sterling Lux had been manipulating market sentiment through targeted misinformation. By noon, the story was dominating headlines. Sterling Lux's hostile takeover exposed, connections to controversial former executive uncovered. Luxury power play. Maison Alon's fight for survival takes a shocking turn. The public backlash was immediate. Investors who had once considered siding with Sterling Lux now hesitated. Customers voiced their anger on social media, vowing to boycott any company aligned with Vaughan. Meanwhile, David was finalizing the second and most crucial part of their plan. For the past 48 hours, he had been in discreet negotiations with a powerful investor, someone with the financial capability to shift the balance of power within the company. This investor, a silent but influential force in the luxury fashion industry, had long admired Maison Alon's recent transformation. It was a gamble. If this investor declined to get involved, Sterling Lux would win. But David had no other choice. As the board meeting commenced, the tension in the room was suffocating. The shareholders took their seats, with Sterling Lux's representatives looking confident, even smug. They believed they had already secured enough votes to oust David and reclaim the company. Mark Ellison, the senior executive who had secretly conspired with Sterling Lux, sat with an air of quiet victory. Richard Vaughan was not present. He was already too toxic to be seen publicly, but his influence lingered in the room. David remained calm. He knew what was coming. The meeting began, and Sterling Lux's lead representative stood, addressing the board with an air of finality. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time to return Maison Alon to stability. We have secured enough support to take this company in the direction it needs. Let us move forward with the vote. David didn't interrupt. He simply leaned back and waited. The doors to the boardroom opened. A figure walked in, flanked by legal advisors. The murmurs around the table turned into stunned silence. It was the investor David had secured. The lead representative of Sterling Lux frowned. Who? Lisa, sitting across from David, allowed herself a small smile. Allow me to introduce Maison Alon's newest major shareholder. The investor placed a folder on the table and calmly slid it forward. As of this morning, my firm has acquired a controlling stake, purchasing the remaining undecided shares. We now hold the decisive vote in this meeting. A stunned hush fell over the room. Sterling Lux had been outmaneuvered. David finally stood. His voice was calm, but every word carried finality. You thought you had this company in your hands. But you underestimated one thing. Maison Alon isn't just a brand. It's a movement. And today, we make it clear, we are not for sale. The final vote took place. Sterling Lux lost. David Carter remained CEO. The hostile takeover was officially dead. Mark Ellison, exposed as a traitor, was stripped of his position immediately. As he walked out, defeated, he passed Lisa in the hallway. "You think this is over?" he muttered. Lisa met his gaze without flinching. "I think you just bet on the wrong side of history." Sterling Lux withdrew in disgrace. Their reputation tarnished. Vaughn, already embroiled in legal battles, had lost his last lifeline. Maison Alon had not just survived, it had won. That evening, Lisa stood outside a Maison Alon storefront, watching as customers walked in and out, engaged, hopeful, excited about what the brand now represented. A young black woman stepped forward, greeted warmly by a sales associate, treated with the dignity that every customer deserved. Lisa exhaled slowly. Not perfect, not finished, but progress. In the end, Maison Alon didn't just survive, it proved that real change is possible when the right people take a stand. But this story isn't just about one company. It's about the choices we make every day, the silent injustices we ignore, and the power of standing up when it matters most. What would you have done in David Carter's shoes? Should businesses take a stand on social issues? Or just focus on profit? Let us know in the comments. If you want more eye-opening stories that expose hidden truths, make sure to subscribe to Undercover Truths, because the truth always finds a way to come out.